This series has been jointly organized by the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism. Professor Gianni here, he has been a key partner with myself and Evan.
We'll start with Singapore. Manchester is an extraordinary place. It was the world's first industrial city. In many ways, it was the place where every piece of modern equipment that you've got, like the railway train, the steam engine, the mining pumps, all kinds of heavy engineering gear, was all invented in Manchester. What they have cleverly done is to switch their trade to being seeing that culture is actually a huge driver. This is their old docklands that is now incredibly animated, essentially by the BBC, by arts institutions, by filmmaking and media and other things. Again, when you think about housing, housing doesn't exist outside a vibrant economy. And part of the job of city fathers and mothers is to make sure that that vibrant economy is going. We'll do the...
you guys have to...
Okay, so this is the big test. This is my first project in Manchester. Let's see if it goes.
Oh, Ash has to go turn that microphone back.
Okay. Okay, so this is a movie that was set on the side of the first project. Any of you who know, that's Albert Finney and that's Liza Minnelli. They were... Okay.
Never been up here at this time of the morning.
So this is an old city working class area.
Where your father was born.
When I first went there, it looked like this. It was extraordinary demolition of old industrial housing. But look at it, it's actually row housing with streets, kind of thing we all think is the basis for urban design now. But incredibly tight.
So you mean a way to pull these lovely old places down?
And a most weird landscape to go around in. So this is, I hate to age myself, but this was me in 1969, going through this entire landscape. And all of those working class traditions of English industrial towns.
I'll see him later.
I bet they'd be thrilled to see you, huh? Does anyone else know you're coming?
I don't think so.
A prophet is always without honor in his own country.
We expect him bonfires in the
There's
streets.
always
and on the
without
flag.
honor in
Welcome
their
back,
homeland.
Charlie.
But then, here we go. Anyhow, this is just a
like it. They wouldn't let me down.
but it's a picture of a world that I remember very well. And so the question is, what do you do on all that vacant land owned by the public sector? Okay, we'll switch to the next slide. Thank you. Fantastic. Well done, tech team here. So this is what the world of Manchester looked like. Basically, in the 20s, actually Engels, when he wrote about the condition of the English working class, he based it on this. And actually, I don't know if you know this, any of you Marxists in the audience, but Engels was actually from a big mill-owning family, and they owned a whole bunch of the mills that, and probably a whole bunch of this workers' housing. So that's what it looked like by then. And keeping going. Incredibly tight, but highly communal. You could never accuse this of not having a community. Keep going. And then it was all knocked down, except for the pubs, bizarrely, because they were owned under a different tenure system. So the pubs got left in the middle of these demolished fields. Next. And what came in behind after it? This. So basically, the council demolished everything, and they decided that they were going to build palaces for the poor. So they built these crescents of extraordinary. They were 7, 8 stories high, deck access at the upper levels. And why did they build these? Next slide. It was because they were copying this. So this, for all the architects among you, you'll know this is Bath. This is John Nash. And these were the real palaces. And essentially, it's possible to sort of conjure the mindset right now, but they really the urban environment was so determined that if you built presence to exactly the right dimensions, or the next slide.
Get there.
Exactly the right dimensions, and the next, you would actually create the perfect conditions for urban life. Now, it seems insane right now, but there actually was an architectural tradition. If ever an architect comes with the answer to life and truth, send them out the back door quickly. You can see here, next slide, quite how formal this was. They actually called these crescents John Nash, Adam, et cetera, et cetera. And very quickly, we can run through the next series. They were built in the modular housing, which has given me an inherent suspicion of modular housing ever since. But we can talk about that more. They worked for about 5 to 10 years. And then we go through the next sequence. It didn't look too bad. And this incredible deck access. So every second floor you had a walkway. And then in moved what are called travelers and started to occupy the site. And that's the pub in the middle. And then it started to get an incredible mess. And then we were asked to come along and fix it. It was the most extraordinary challenge. Basically, this completely collapsed housing scheme. And for some reason, which I can never quite remember why it was, we got sole sourced to come and do a new scheme. So in about 10 minutes, we produced this scheme and saying that we're going to recreate a street system. We're going to recreate street and block and mix and all these things, but do it in a way that essentially has a social mix, an environmental mix, a workplace mix, and an ecological mix. Next. And so what's fascinating is that's the master plan we did in 1990, and beside it is an aerial photograph from yesterday where they actually built the whole damn thing, just like what we asked them to do it. We didn't have a hell of a big role afterwards. We were just design advisors afterwards, but they decided that was actually what they wanted to do. So keep going. So you can see here in the figure ground drawings, street and block in 1951, incredibly tight, insane architecture in 1991, with no understanding of how you make space, of how people live, of how people work and move around. And then in 2000, street and block, but with much more generosity of street space, which seems to have worked. We'll just run through the next sequence recently, quickly. Okay. So there we are in 51. Looking like this. This is where every working class drama was set in those kinds of accommodations. Then in 1991, the Brave New World, which lasted about 15 years before it started to fall apart, literally fall apart, fell down. And then the 2000 plan of street and blocks, but with more space around them and more mix. Okay, next. And so we'll run through this sequence. So this is what it looks like today. That church is one of the remaining vestiges of the early world. Next. And you can see a very generous mix of housing, of open space. At the back is the city center. It's incredibly close to the city center, where the old neighborhood was completely cut off from the city center. The old phrase, always connect, always connect. To the north is the city center, to the east is the University of Manchester. And there was no way to get to the University of Manchester. There's a great trench of a freeway that had been put in between, so we put bridges over it. So you've got to remember, it's not just housing, it's where do you work? Where do you go to work? Where do you go to the soccer game? Where do you have fun? You've got to put all of those things together. Okay, keep going. And this is just zeroing down on a very tight, I think, extremely successful mix, all kinds of tenure types, all kinds of housing scale. Next. Another one, and next. And I honestly think my proudest achievement, this is a main street with shops on it and pedestrians and activity and bustle. The hardest damn thing to do in urban planning and urban design is to make a decent street. One of the ways we made this decent street is that you can see that big arch. That is a bridge which runs over to the university. We were able to bring all the energy of the university and the students into the site by making that direct connection. Okay, next. And yes, we had deck access housing, but this is co-op housing. And again, the tenure type is really important. We have so few varieties in tenure type in Canada. But what is fascinating about just a slight excursion on English housing, but you probably all know that all the housing you saw before was council housing, that the Crescents, owned by Manchester City Council. They were terrible landlords. They never looked after it. It all fell apart. They didn't know what to do. So Margaret Thatcher, who is much reviled in many political circles, but basically said, we're getting rid of council housing. She believed, like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, that you had to have a stake in your housing to look after it and to care for it. So what she did was essentially create housing associations. She gave all of these housing units and land to publicly regulated, non-profit, private housing associations, who did the vast majority of the development here. And that's, again, a development vehicle that's absolutely absent in Canada. It was marginally present, as I'll talk about later, but the lack of a publicly spirited developer is a huge hole in our housing offering. Okay, next. And again, beginning to experiment with slightly more intense housing. There's no high-rise housing in the area yet, but I think the next generation will produce that. Next. And we got Manchester Metropolitan University. This is a huge achievement. Again, universities are a crucial piece of the social consensus to create the kind of community that you need if you're going to have a successful housing offer. Because what that does is it offers aspiration and achievement and education rather than corralling the poor in one space with no way out. Okay, next. So I'm going to finish up with Toronto, where I've spent most of my working life. And part of the thing I went into in the book is that Toronto is what I call an accidental metropolis. Nobody ever meant it to be a serious city, including itself. It never had any ambition, still has really no ambition, but it's become an incredibly powerful and important city by accident. And it's now got really quite ridiculously big and still operating with no kind of plot to it in terms of where it's trying to end up to be. Next slide. It's interesting that the first project I worked on in Toronto was the St. Lawrence neighborhood. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but this is the first co-op housing, nonprofit housing, mixed-use housing neighborhood in Toronto. And actually, it was this place that I worked on that gave me the essential DNA for what we should do in Manchester. In fact, if you look at this, it looks a bit like what we just saw in Manchester, because we had Jane Jacobs be our sort of informal advisor on this, and she said, "Well, you know, I think the magic quotient is you should only have one rent geared to income person out of 4 total units, something like a quarter, because." Really, if you want to know who's supporting the shops, who's looking after the schools, who's nagging the politicians to keep the streets clean, who's making sure that the grass is cut and the snow is plowed, it actually won't generally be the rent geared to income person. It'll be the other 3, but the benefit of the other 3 more middle class folk will essentially ensure that there is a good community environment. So she, like Lee Kuan Yew and like eventually Manchester City Council, hated 100% rent geared to income housing. And this has proven to be an extraordinarily resilient model. Within the about now 8,000 units of St. Lawrence, Only, I think, a quarter are rent geared to income, and there are at least 10 different development companies doing different things, nonprofit developers. Now, this was funded in the late 70s, early 80s, up into the mid 80s. The funding programs on which it depended have completely disappeared. So we are now the only serious world country that has no serious public housing funding model. And that is, in other words, all of the things that you've seen in Singapore, Manchester, and Toronto, you can't do in Canada right now. Next. So again, this is the first time we actually did a mixed-use building with a public school, a Catholic school, and the 3-to-1 rent geared to income co-op housing mix. That again, probably a building it's impossible to build because of insane regulation right now, but highly successful. Okay, next. So why is this important? As I said, I live in the accidental metropolis. This is what Toronto looked like in 2000. And if you take all those big office towers there and just go slightly to the east, to the right of them, you'll actually see the St. Lawrence, so sort of a triangular prow, and then the big esplanade running through there. So that was a pretty huge achievement. Since then, there's been a dramatic development of the Regent Park scheme, which in many ways, which is to the north, that's right, a little bit in that general area. And that again has tried to use those basic Jane Jacobs principles about mix of social mix, community mix, building type mix, use mix, etc. mix. And why is this important? Is because, next slide, that's what happened in 25 years. Now you just flick back and forth a little bit on that. Toronto is an extraordinary growing place. I mean, every time I see this, I go crazy because we're basically putting on 1 million people in what you see here, which is only a fraction of the city. And it's largely been a huge success, I have to say. But we are into an incredible, we still are clearly not building enough. We are into an extraordinary affordability problem. And as you can see, all of these high rises are constrained by low density neighborhoods all the way around. And so 70% of the city is that low density texture. And so we're essentially preventing ourselves from building on 70% of the urban land. That's the next challenge that we're going to have to make, what everybody's calling the missing middle that we're going to have to move into. And why is this important? The next slide. It's because essentially the job of a city, the recipe for a city was given to us by Confucius. That basically a city has to do things, make local people happy and attract immigrants from afar. Toronto is about to be past Chicago. It's going to pass Los Angeles. It's catching up on New York City as the biggest city in the US and Canada. That is basically because we are attracting immigrants from afar, but we are failing to make them and local people happy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Joe. That was great. So one of our panelists, Vikram Bhatt, Vikram, hopefully you can hear us and maybe you can switch on your camera, has asked to make a presentation before we move into the panel. And Vikram, I am probably going to switch the slides for you. So if you
can I just ask a couple of clarification questions so that then it would be easier. Singapore, you can hear me all right, correct?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Singapore has about 5-6 million people. I don't know the exact number. The space is less than 500 square kilometers. It's smaller than the island of Montreal, with population of about 1.8 or less. Greater Toronto has a population which is close to that of Toronto, to Singapore. And the space that you have in Toronto is, I would say, 10 times larger or greater than that of Singapore. So that the geography within which one is operating in Toronto or in Montreal has a profound impact on how we manage that asset, our land, who controls it, how it's managed, how it's navigated, and how it gets monopolized. And you showed the example of that very clearly, where the concentration is going, how the developers are forcing certain kinds of development. And we are hired hands in some of these instances.
I regret that I didn't pick a question up. Maybe you can summarize what that might have been, if there was.
Just that the geographical space within which one is building buildings, we have a very different context compared to what Singapore. And therefore, the kind of interventions which we have are perhaps, and will have to be different. But unfortunately, what is happening is we have kind of typical concentration of dense areas and then spread out solutions happen. Is it because of the geography that we have, or we have the land, it is controlled by interests, which is very complex.
I think that supports, Joe, your idea that Toronto is an accidental metropolis. I think Vikram is saying it developed in relatively low density because there was a lot of land and a relatively modest population. The problem now is there is no longer a relatively modest population, and most of the available land is already privately owned by people who control low density development.
All right. Obviously, I think that's true, and the absence of significant land holdings in public ownership is a big problem. Although they are far more common than we think. If you just have to go around Ottawa and see, there is an enormous store of publicly owned land that is underdeveloped, and that's honestly true in an awful lot of cities. The other reality is that the planning system essentially determines the price of land because it determines what can be done with land. So it's perfectly possible to liberalize the planning system and do it in exchange for the kind of housing program that you want. And that, again, a clever city can manage, I think, quite successfully. So I take the point that there aren't the huge tracts of land available, but there are actually, if you take the huge low density areas of most cities and the huge public lands of most cities, far more land than we generally acknowledge.
Plus, Singapore has 80% of housing that is produced by the state. That control also is very significant. 80% of housing.
Yes, 80%. Yeah. In
Yes.
fact, the number I had is 85%. So
yeah. Plus, the way it's controlling the urban development and use of automobiles and other things with taxation is also a very significant thing for bringing it forth so that people have certain context, I think. But I totally agree with what the presentation was. Can we move forward and show, there is a slide with 2 slides of Schindler House in the series of slides that I have shown, sent.
Let me try to get there, Vikram. Tell me when.
Further down, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on. Go on, please. Further, further, further. That's it. Go back. Okay. I would like to go back on a very small scale. This is a project which is 100 years old. Schindler's House in Hollywood. Schindler and Child, they created a community of 2 families, 4 people. And they thought of a house, which was, in my opinion, one of the most revolutionary ones. And it still remains so. In this house, there was no living room. In this house, there was no dining room. In this house, there was no bedroom. There were studios for 2 couples. So there were studios. They came together as a kind of cooperative living where they came and they had a kitchen in which they kind of ate and cooked and did things around. They had very minimum shower type bathrooms created. Bedrooms were on the roof, which were like a pavilion on which they would climb up and sleep. And the construction also was perhaps the most avant-garde, considering the time in which it was built. They were Austrian immigrants. They came, and the house is still there. It's a museum now, and it's a very worth visiting. It's the most contemporary house that was built by the modernists of that period. Schindler separated from his wife, and then the other house was occupied by Richard Neutra and others, and many other people lived in these houses. But the idea that you can create a community of 2 families and then it can grow, this, I think, was one of the most revolutionary ones. When they approached, the municipality refused that they would be able to build anything in there. Further on, they gave them permit with the provision that they can pull the permit back anytime. But the building has survived. It has become a monument, a classified monument, and so on. So what I'm putting forward is, at least if we want to think about challenges for the millennials, one has to start building linkages and connections within your own community if one wants to get ahead in this process. And each generation faces these problems. Can you go back to the top of the presentation? Next slide, please. In early 70s, energy crisis, post-Expo Montreal, housing was very difficult. And I was a young person at that moment in time. And I was living in this gray stone housing. And next to it was a juggernaut. Cité Concordia was the big developer who had built the world's biggest building leading up to Expo in downtown Montreal on CN rail yards, Place Bonaventure. And they slowly but surely had acquired multi-block properties just on the shoulder of the city. And they wanted to tear down these buildings and put up urban renewal project. This is where the community came together to resist some of it. And part of it was certainly destroyed and Concordia project was put up. But because the community was together, we didn't have money. There were some people who had regular jobs, professors. I was just a young researcher at that moment in time, and there were many others. However, with coming together and meeting, the program which made this thing possible was a non-profit co-op with intermediary groups like Phyllis Lemba and Heritage Montreal, which made it possible for us, next please, to convert this multi-block development. This was the biggest housing co-op conversion in the 70s in whole of Canada. Until today, this is a stable, balancing community, non-profit that has managed to stabilize up to a point a housing stock. There were many others that followed: conversion of old schools, conversion of old empty facilities. Now there are discussions about what to do with projects like Hotel Dieu and other old hospitals which are sitting empty. So there is out there the way Schindler's did 100 years ago. Some of us did 75 to 85 years, not years ago, in 75 to 85, in that decade, was a very significant kind of, and we had places. I moved on in life. I had my wife's nephew stay in the place, then he moved on in life, and we gave back that cooperative unit to the co-op, and it's still going strong. However, as was mentioned earlier, these programs are very few and far between. But when these things happened in Montreal, 70% of housing was rental housing. And we were able to move into a housing which became a stable housing where people contributed their labor and so on. The next chapter was, next slide please, was again challenge of land, the price of land, service land going up and up. Colleagues who put up this a modest project of Grow Home in Montreal became a great success. It was a very small 14-foot wide narrow townhouse. Next please. And this project produced about $4 billion worth of housing stock, which was put up by small developers in different pockets of land all around Montreal and in other cities around Quebec. And this was a straight, very narrow front. So it was going back onto the old housing models with the streets and other solutions. Next, please. And these were framed within an evolutionary Grow Home. It was not a progressive housing in the kind of where you start modestly and build bigger, but it was leaving parts of the homes unfinished so that people can finish them inside when the money came. The basement was left unfinished, the upstairs was left unfinished, and so on. Next. And then the next home, which the previous project I showed was done by Witold Rybczynski and Avi Friedman, my colleagues at McGill. And this was the next home project that Avi did, which saw that there was need for a whole range of housing. The small house, medium house, big house, and all put together. So there are 3-4 families who can stay in this kind of homes. And again, this was a very successful project which was taken up by developers. Next. And these are some of the variations of it you can see. Next. And you can see the family. The progressive construction ideas, we work internationally with Balkrishna Doshi's foundation. Minimum Cost Housing Group at McGill was their research partner. And that idea was much more progressively building the homes and creating communities around really measurable kind of precincts which were created. Next. And these were some of the demonstration homes which you see. Next. And over the years, the community, here you have a township which was planned for about 50,000, today about 80,000 people are living in this township. Next. And there is other frontier still out there, which we have not in the United States. This is the lowest end of housing. A decent home, it's a recent film, which was a documentary film which was made about the mobile home parks. We have not looked at variations and designs of housing, and can these kinds of housing become part of our urban landscape? This is a great challenge worth asking from the community, from the designers, as well as from the decision makers' point of view, if we really want to address the challenge of millennial housing and moving beyond. Thanks. Has anyone seen this film? This housing is about one of the biggest housing, which is a rental housing. People own their homes, but the lands are rented to them. And this is under a major attack by great corporations across. And what is it, how it's decimating these communities in the United States, it's worth looking at, and how communities are rising up in different parts of the United States in various states, from Iowa to Colorado, and you find that people want to be housed well and want to live in that community. It is not just the shape or form of it. It is what we consider a kind of a broad landscape that really needs to be seen very clearly. What we have painted ourselves in, partnered with, is a standard belief that this is what is the home, a finished home. What I would argue is, from the time when Schindler's did to the mobile homes, that is what I think is really the point of entry of housing, if you want to believe that one really has to think.
Thank you so much, Vikram. Those are great observations. I think that's a great note on which to now move to a bit of a panel discussion. I think I missed a little bit of what you were saying with the mobile home here, but we did see last week when we were talking about different financing options, some land lease options that come with mobile homes or manufactured homes on them that are available in various parts of Canada. But I think you raised an interesting point too. One is that a home doesn't have to be a standalone thing, and that if we work together cooperatively, we can actually aggregate units of housing, get a slightly higher density, but still have what we want to achieve. And I am very aware that last week when we talked through a bunch of different financial options or options for financing and home ownership, we didn't really get into the cooperative model, which I think is kind of poorly defined and even less understood here in Canada, because there are a variety of different models that operate under that name. So with that, I'd like to open the discussion up to the panel. Maybe I could start. Rodney, you, I think I primed you with this question already. You are involved with creating a community from scratch. Did you have a target for tenancy in that community, or is the market driving what you build? The balance between renters and owners. And I know you're trying to incorporate an affordable housing into the community too. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the original vision for Zibi and how it's working out as you work through the economics. This is the sustainability of economics.
Yeah, great. As we embarked on the master planning of Zibi, certainly we believed that healthy cities are like healthy ecosystems. They have a lot of diversity. And so we were intentional about trying to create as broad of spectrum of diversity of housing typologies and tenure options think there's, if you go back one there was actually, there's an aerial shot of ZB. Now, obviously, this is an urban dense environment. So, in terms of there were limits to our typologies and options, we weren't going to do single family homes, but we have townhouse style units. We've done condos, we have rentals. We're under construction with a building right now that has a co-living component. So that's a rental tenure, but kind of a more community-based tenure that can also help facilitate greater affordability. So we have been quite intentional about trying to create that spectrum. That being said, how is it working out? That was the vision. It has worked out. We have homeowners who live there. We have renters that live there. We have co-living units under construction. We have a partnership with a nonprofit affordable housing provider that will own some units there in the not too distant future. But the market also does drive some realities. You do have, in terms of thinking about financing right now, the honest reality is the condo market's very tough in Ottawa right now. Trying to, unlike Toronto, where you showed the 20 to 25 and a lot of those towers that show up in that meantime, in that 25-year span, were condo towers. Ottawa's market has always been a little bit tepid on that front, a little slower moving in terms of the market appetite on that front. And so we're a little heavier, more heavily geared towards the rental side right now. That being said, I think Ottawa has a lower percentage of rental than a lot of European cities, is for example, that you would look at. And I don't think, I think sometimes there's a stigma around rentals, and that people living in rental units don't contribute positively to community or don't have a sense of place. And I don't think that has to be the case. I think one of the things we're trying to do at ZB, and I think with a degree of success, is being quite intentional around the idea of community building. And it doesn't matter what tenure that you're existing, that whether you're a renter there or whether you own a unit. We do have our One Planet team who have a whole host of activities that happen on site where people get a chance to engage with the neighbors. We have community gardens that exist on site. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're a renter or your owner, you can create some of that sense of ownership by participating in sustainability programs, in the arts programs that we have happening, in the community garden piece that we have. So I think we're trying with some degree of success to create that kind of buy-in to the community through some of those alternate means.
Maybe I can ask a correlate question then. Ross, are you also involved with One Planet
Yes.
and various? What does the One Planet vision offer to this, and about home ownership and tenancy and tenure?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So if you want to just go to the first slide, it does. So One Planet Living is a sustainability framework, and it's kind of formulated around 10 principles. So instead of just being more of a standard building certification program, something like LEED, like it's a little bit more holistic in nature. And so over the last few years, Windmill Developments, in partnership with Epic Investments in Toronto, have created a real estate impact fund. And so all of our portfolio of future projects and everything that we've got kind of on the go at the moment is all focused around One Planet Living. All of our developments will be One Planet endorsed, same as the ZB project is. And it creates this opportunity not only to look at the building, but also to look at the lifestyles of the people that live there. And try to, exactly as Rodney was just saying, like create this model for success so that you're not just creating the opportunity for something to happen and then you walk away and hope that it does, because quite often that doesn't work. That doesn't work so well. We've had buildings in the past where we sold garden plots on the roof, and they're great for about a year, but if there's not a program that helps to keep it up, it kind of falls apart, and eventually it just looks like a bunch of weeds up there. So I guess that doesn't necessarily answer the question as far as the tendency of renters versus owners. But I think overall, it's trying to look at a framework so that you do have a mixture across the board. So maybe that does come in more with community and culture, equity, and local economy. Some of the other developments we're working on, we've got one in the West End right now that's about 510 units called the Parkway House development. And that's spread over 3 buildings. And we're still looking at the mixture of what we'll have between rental and for sale condo, but it will undoubtedly be a mixture of the two. And if you look at what's happening in the West End of Ottawa, most everything that's been approved or that's in the planning phase right now is all rental. So, I think we'll probably have one of the few kind of for sale products in that area, but even within our little niche, we'll have both for sure.
Thank you. And when we go out, and especially when I went out and we were looking for a house, many of our friends and the real estate agents told us that if you go for a new build, say after 1990s, the materials that you get in there, they're not up to they're not of good quality. Or if you buy an older house, the possibility that, you might get a sound construction and material quality would be better. And then I saw you have materials and products, and I was wondering then if this rush and for making affordable housing and rapid housing initiatives and such, does that take into account this longevity of the build? How can we ensure that, after 20 years, they're not degraded and go into landfill? Is that a scenario that is happening? And I know you're addressing that, but what do you feel about?
I'll take a stab at that, but probably not the only one that should speak on it. With regard to materiality, I think anytime we're designing homes, we're designing buildings, they're designed to last 50, 100 years. They're not designed to last 20 years necessarily. With regard to what materials go into those building products, it always struck me as odd. So I started my career in California. I spent about 10 years out there. And obviously California has very strong regulations when it comes to everything from building materials to anything else. And when you walk into any hospital in the state of California, there will be a sticker on the door of that hospital that says, this building contains products that are known to cause cancer. So you walk into a building that has that, and there's no way around that necessarily at the time. Excuse me. So, we're trying to start to work with a lens of healthy building materials. But I think your question is more around the durability of things. I would suggest that one of the many ways to get to where you can have a fast-tracked project that still allows for longevity and durability is to try to prefabricate as many of those products as you can offsite, so that you're making them with precision, with durability, and something that will last. But you're allowed to erect it on site quite fast. So if you're doing something like a prefabricated timber building, as an example, you design that in advance, you manufacture as many products as you can offsite, you bring those on site, and they get erected really quickly, which also has great benefits from the development and the construction side of things. You're going to reduce just your financing, carrying costs, et cetera, for the amount of time you're on site. But you're still building with the same quality that you would from a traditional steel or concrete building. It also has great environmental benefits at the same time. I don't know if Rodney or Joe has anything else to add there.
If you live long enough,
A quick thought.
to experience something.
The problem with low-income housing is traditionally it's been conflated with being publicly managed housing. And historically, public agencies, municipal housing agencies, provincial housing agencies have not been good landlords. Low-income housing gets very hard-worn. And it doesn't get enough love and care and kindness. That's why the switch that I mentioned in England to go from council housing to nonprofit community co-op housing has been much more successful, because it actually has engaged the tenants in caring about the managing of the housing they're in.
Yeah, The other model.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to go back quickly to Rodney here with a question on the ZB project. Could you elaborate further on what is considered exactly affordable housing at that development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a slide up of a project we're doing in partnership right now with CADCO, which is the consulting arm of CCOC, the biggest nonprofit housing provider in the city after Ottawa Community Housing. And they have a whole thing on the spectrum of affordable housing. We throw out the word all the time to sort of say affordable housing. What is affordable housing? And there's 1,000 different definitions, but the reality is that it exists on a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum is, deeply affordable housing for people on ODSP, for people who need deep levels of social support. We don't have any supportive housing at ZB currently. The next level on that spectrum that comes up just a hair is call it below market housing that has a degree of support and subsidization that really requires a nonprofit partner. And so that's why I referenced that we have a partnership with a nonprofit partner who's able to bring grants to the table, that's able to do a much deeper level of affordability than what I would call market affordable. So that next level up is what I call market. So we have some of this more deep, not to the level of supportive housing or ODSP housing, but nonprofit subsidized housing, for lack of a better term. So we have some of that piece. And then we actually have quite a bit of what I would describe as, call it market affordable, which CMHC has their definition of affordability is that your housing costs don't exceed 30% of your income. So what CMHC does is they take a look and sort of say, okay, well, what is a median income in a neighborhood, and what would an average person be able to afford as it relates to housing, their all-in housing costs, and it not exceed 30%. And CMHC, to their great credit, actually has developed some finance programs at the MLI Select program and the RCFI program. I won't get into too many kind of financing details, but they've developed programs to kind of encourage market affordable housing. And so the first two rental buildings that we did are CMHC would say these are affordable buildings. They meet the affordability requirements. 80% plus of the units in those buildings would be deemed affordable by CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, to be affordable. So we have kind of a spectrum of affordability that exists at that project. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, sort of. So then my follow-up question to that is, who qualifies for said units? And then I'm imagining that those units are not necessarily listed on Realtor, for example. So again, when we're talking about below market housing, is it do you as an individual, couple, or a group have to go through some special program? This is the part that I'm a little bit green on. I don't fully understand it.
Yeah, great. So for call it the subsidized housing, the nonprofit subsidized housing, they draw from the wait list, which is actually the City of Ottawa has a couple of different wait lists just to make this even more complicated. But they pull, and you can get yourself on the wait list. My understanding right now is there's about 12,000 people on the wait list for subsidized housing, which is a terrible shame and speaks to the kind of housing affordability crisis we have in this city. But that's how you would access the kind of nonprofit, a more deeply affordable housing. What I would describe as the market affordable housing, that just works on a straight, first come, first serve. People who show up. We have a leasing office that's down at ZB, and that's a whole range of, people that come from a whole host of different backgrounds. There's no there's no income checks or validation. Those are people who show up with an interest to lease and first come, first serve, and that's how that works.
One experience
That's all
I
rentals. Yeah.
from Montreal.
And then coming shortly, this co-living, which I think is also quite interesting.
One
Yeah,
experience.
sure. So it's in partnership with a New York firm called Common, and it's kind of, you know, in some regards, you could look at it as and on the one end, there's again a little bit of spectrum, not to use that word too many times, but it's a modern take in some regards in the rooming house, which was the rooming house is you know, some of the very most affordable housing that we've produced over the past 100 years, but they certainly fell out of favor. They became impossible to zone and developed a bit of a stigma associated with it. But the co-living that we have coming in this new building, there's actually 3 different types. So some floors exist where you're effectively renting a room, but with large shared public areas. So you have shared kitchen, shared living room, shared facility on that front. And by doing that, obviously you can drive much greater degree of affordability. And we have some floors that are actually just much smaller units, you know, that you have the full complement of facilities within your unit, but they're small. And you can get away with those smaller units because the building has a host of amenities. So you can go down to the, you know, the co-working facility effectively there, the gym that's in the building, the rooftop terrace, et cetera. And then we have some units that are kind of more standard size units, but all of those get tied together with an element of programming. So I was talking about before the idea that there's, you know, a yoga class that you can attend if you want to on a weekly basis, you know, bike ride up into Gatineau Park, et cetera, as a kind of voluntary way to build community. If you don't want to participate, you don't have to, but if you want to participate in the community gardening and the yoga, et cetera, as a way to kind of build community both through design and through programming, and the kind of additional benefit on that is that you can drive to greater degrees of affordability.
One traditional housing model that worked very well for the longest time is multiplexes of one.
Week, which is, can we get a greater range of living options available in which we could actually accumulate some equity? And I know that that's something you've been trying to do in the past and have a lot of trouble with. I think most of this crowd is actually interested in jumping into that, you know, jumping over that hurdle into ownership, and are looking for ways in or other ways in than the traditional financing methods.
Yeah, as you know, this is something we've been dancing around a little bit with our good friends at CADCO and CCOC without anything necessarily percolating to the surface. We haven't yet messed around with the idea about especially trying to tie co-living together with affordable home ownership. I'm quite enthusiastic about the concept, looking at, you know, Trillium Homes, Option for Homes, and the work that they're doing. I do think that's part of the future. You know, the Ottawa I moved to, it wasn't that long ago. I'm old, but not that old. But when I first moved here, I bought my first house for $135,000, which was an old piece of crap, run down former cottage, but on the Ottawa River. And I can't believe it now when I think about it, you know. And we didn't need those kinds of supports necessarily to get people on the home ownership ladder. But I think those are things, and unfortunately yet in Ottawa, we haven't yet had anyone like a Trillium's or an Option for Home step forward to be able to make that affordable home ownership. They were here last week. Are they coming?
Homeownership alternatives came last week.
Oh, great.
And I mean, Joe has been talking a lot about in that transition from council housing to the not-for-profit housing providers. There was also a transition that allowed ownership and a different number of tenancy or tenure models. Ross, has Windmill broached this at all?
Yeah, so I will say, for that that Parkway House project that we have, it's actually the last slide if you, just to give somebody a visual to look at. But we'll be exploring that there. In full transparency, we're finishing up the rezoning effort for that project right now with the city. So yeah, that's this project here. So we're a little bit of ways from starting the design in earnest and then getting into construction and figuring out.
Are you still on a non-disclosure?
I'm talking about it here, so hopefully I'm not breaking too many rules. No, we're not. But so the for sale side of that, we would be looking at the Trillium housing option for second mortgages. And on the rental side, we'll be looking at the CMHC options as well. So that's something we've told the city we're committed to exploring for sure.
That's great.
The biggest rental housing that is available in Montreal is in duplexes, triplexes, and fiveplexes. These are small owners.
My question is for Rodney. You mentioned when you moved into Ottawa, you found something for $100,000. And I was just curious, have you ever put thoughts into it? How was that possible back then? What has changed? And relative to that category of the CATCO and CMHC, 30% of your income towards rent, do you have some sort of a base numbers from back then? And was that considered affordable? Obviously, because you weren't able to afford it, but what do you think has changed that today someone that makes that much or relative percentage cannot even get into a detach or a semi or anything?
I give a lot of thought to that. I have 2 teenage daughters, and thinking about the Ottawa I moved to 17 years ago compared to the Ottawa of today. And I'm sure you all follow my Twitter feed religiously. I tweeted out, I don't know, this is maybe like 6 months ago, a photo of 2 very, very similar bungalows, built in and around the same time, in and around the same square footage, in 2 very similar sized cities, growing at a nearly identical rate. And one was $150,000 and the other was $1.5 million. And one is the city of Houston and the one is the city of Toronto. And now the city of Houston has a whole host of other problems, right? They have and Joe might reach over here and strangle me because he's an amazing urban planner, and the kind of sprawl issue. But when you look at from an affordability angle, why is it that the identical house in Houston and Toronto, same size city, they're growing at the same rate? Why is it $150,000 here and $1.5 million in Toronto? Is it that the developers in Houston are that much more philanthropic? Are they less greedy developers in Houston than they are in Toronto? No, obviously not, right? It's a whole host of policy and regulatory decision-making that have contributed in large part to our challenges in and around affordability. And so, one of the things that Joe referenced was when you look at Toronto and Ottawa is identical. We don't have as dramatic of slides, but when you look at how we set up our planning frameworks, we have a very small amount of area that allows for density, and people have to blow it out to build towers. And the rest we maintain as very low density single family homes. So
let me just pick up on exactly that point and the Houston point, because there's a very good New York Times article on exactly this question. Why is Houston 10 times Toronto 10 times Houston? They allow missing middle redevelopment. You cannot stop someone coming onto your single family house street, buying up 5 units and putting up an apartment building. And that happens. So they basically are recycling the city continuously. What we have done in our planning system in Ontario is essentially to freeze in place everything that is single family. And it's very, very hard to change it because councils are elected by single family homeowners and essentially that is a terrible fix. So it's land at the base of it that is the difference in, I think that gives a difference in the sale price. And we have just essentially eliminated available urban housing land. We've given it all to single family homeowners. I'm going to beat you. I bought my first Toronto house for $38,000 in the 80s. And it would now sell for about $1.7 million. And my children cannot buy houses either. And this is a huge problem. And it's the last slide on this immigration question. Canada is unique in countries in really welcoming immigration and really, quite candidly, having made it work very, very well. But you cannot invite 500,000 people to our country and give them nowhere to live. And we are doing that right now. And we are in for big trouble if we keep doing that. And let's keep having the 500,000 people, please. But we have got to free up urban land. Yes, I mean, what's interesting as well is, without getting into any kind of stereotype, but I'll do a stereotype. Most immigrants want to own a home. That's characteristically, it's millennials who might be happy renting or being in a condo tower, but if you're making the great trek of changing your life and coming to this strange cold country, you'll want to have a house.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I just had a question in regards to that initial envisioning for a new community or new building where you have all this sustainability in mind versus kind of the end product. And the end of the day, like we talk about these perfect cities, right? These perfect cities have enormous costs to them. And if we want to get sustainable, we want to get net zero, those costs go up and up and up. How do you, and I guess this is more tailored to Rodney and Ross here, how do you as an organization balance, that decision between providing sustainable initiatives, amenity spaces versus balancing that kind of more affordable price point? At what point, I'm going to use Dockside Green Windmills development. You started off with this massive wood chip burning facility and you started off with the mixed use buildings, and then financially, I guess it didn't work for a time and a period, but how do you balance that from an organizational perspective, between sustainability and, working with your performance? Where do you, I'm just thinking about COVID, construction prices going through the roof, land prices going through the roof. You guys already own the land, but how do you balance some of those initial ideas versus that end product? And where is that line for maybe taking away some of those initial ideas?
Great question. I think Rodney and I could probably both speak to this. Rodney should definitely comment on the district energy plan at Z, because that's a wonderful example. But even at a smaller scale, like what some of the buildings I'm working on with Windmill now, like we're starting with a baseline HVAC system where we're going to explore a geothermal option always as our baseline, and that works great from an energy efficiency perspective. The other thing that it does for us is most of the times that we're exploring this, we're doing that with a provider that does a design, build, own, and operate system model, and basically selling that energy back to the end user at a rate that is guaranteed to be at or below a typical market rate. So what that does for us as a developer is that actually moves the money and the capital required to provide the infrastructure for that upfront away from us, and it amortizes it over however long the contract is, typically a 30-year period, to the end owner. So it allows for us to to guarantee that we're going to be providing a system that's extremely energy efficient. It allows for the end user to be able to have a system that they know is moving in the right direction from a global environmental sustainability standpoint. They're also not going to be charged any additional money for doing that. What they unfortunately are not always able to get there is a lower utility bill, because there's this third party in here that has to make some profit for being able to do that. So they're amortizing that over a certain period of time. So that's the way that model works. And Rodney probably could speak to this a lot further, even on the ZB example. But.
Yeah, and this is a tough one, right? Like it's like so many things in life, right? It's sometimes sustainability and affordability can go together hand in hand. And we look for every opportunity to do that. So the rental building that you can see if you're ever on the Chaudière Bridge, the rental building you can see under construction right now, which is a 24-story building. We did a design competition at the start of it, and the winner of the design competition had this super sweet, sexy kind of waterfall terrace building. It's gorgeous. I loved it. But as we really as we really started digging in, there was that much more envelope that was so much trickier to reach the energy performance targets that we wanted, and really added to the cost. And so it's a little, there's a little tiny part of me when I look at that building going up each day, and I sort of say, oh, it was so sexy, and now it's so rectangular. But those are the kinds of things that actually where sustainability and affordability tie together nicely, right? The same design decisions that were driving the energy performance of that building actually also help drive improved affordability for that building. The district energy system at ZB works a little bit differently in terms of that we don't have a third-party provider for the zero carbon energy that we provide to whether you're a renter or a homeowner. But we've set up our own company that does it. So we're that energy provider, and we treat that as a separate business. So instead of getting a bill from Enbridge for the gas, you're getting a bill from the ZB community utility. That's the same bill that you'd get from Enbridge from a dollar value point of view, but instead of it being a gas bill, you're getting a zero carbon district energy system. But so those pieces I think are relatively straightforward, but the other pieces are, just a kind of constant challenge about, trying to do additional rooftop gardens, but how does that impact on affordability? So we're always playing around with how far can we push the energy performance envelope until we really start impacting on affordability piece. And there's this, there's sweet spots that come in there. So I think the answer in part is your question in terms of like, we're always trying to do that balancing act.
I think maybe just one other thing to add there as well is like, you would see this at ZB as well. We're starting with a mandate that we're going to be zero carbon. So we have to figure out a way to make that work. And so in the case of the rental building, some sacrifices had to be made in terms of the built form, and you're always going to have to find some way to make that work. At our Stone Abbey project in Old Ottawa South, I intentionally didn't put a slide about that project on here because admittedly we're not targeting millennials with that project. However, from an energy standpoint, to make that one work, it's a beautiful building. It's got a lot of envelope because of the way we had to fit it onto the site, but it doesn't have a lot of windows. It has a very small window to wall ratio. Although it's got fantastic views, they're just really framed in the right way. So I think if we were talking to any buyer that hadn't seen the building, they would say, oh, I'm on the canal. Like I better have floor to ceiling glass and it better be the entire wall. Well, it's not, but it's framed in the right way that we can get the energy performance and still make the targets work.
So we started the evening with references to the perfect city and the ideal city, and Jane Jacobs was brought up and the 15-minute city was brought up. And I'm circling back to that beginning point with a question about cultural sustainability and efforts towards maintaining the spaces that are on street level so that the cultural fabric that is existing within city centers can be sustainable. From my observations in Ottawa specifically, we have a lot of garages and industrial spaces, warehouses that are identified for high rises, for development, for densifying the city center. But one of the consequences of that is displacing the small businesses, the more cultural spaces, the grocery stores, the smaller private grocery stores, restaurants, and so forth. And you can see this happening in Chinatown and Hintonburg, Mechanicsville, it used to be called. And I'm wondering if any of you have experience with circumstances where there was a successful relocation of these smaller businesses once a high-rise comes in. So like a condominium, for example, would typically have like a Rexall or a Shoppers Drug Mart, a really big company occupy that retail space. Have you ever seen a circumstance where a small business is subsidized or encouraged to return so that that mixed use cultural fabric is maintained?
Maybe I'll start off on that. It's a very good angle to take. And one of the things that I've realized is that the role that cultural activity can play in real estate value creation, I think has been greatly underestimated. I think some of you may be familiar with the Distillery District in Toronto and Witchwood Barns and some of the other projects where a wonderful sort of part civic, part private nonprofit called Artscape started realizing that artists were being chased out of all of the spaces in the city center. So actually created space where it could catch them because it realized they were valued. They were actually creating a place that was very attractive. So the Distillery District, which was an old complex, a distillery, a gin distillery area with a lot of lovely old buildings. It had been hanging out forever and going nowhere. So what Artscape did was to move artists into those buildings. And all of a sudden, that creativity, that buzz, the fact that there were interesting stores and shops and galleries, etc., created a world where people actually wanted to build apartment buildings. And that then created even more value. So it was a very virtuous circle. I'm involved with a project right now in Picton, where it's a huge old airfield, and we have about 70 buildings left over from the 40s and the 50s. And we've got the guy, Tim Jones, who created Artscape, to help us get those things going, because otherwise this is a totally barren site and nobody in their right mind would want to live there. But we can create that buzz, that activity, that feel. And I think in Zibi, you're trying to do exactly that kind of thing. I don't know much about it, but I think actually the time for realizing the value of small business, and particularly of cultural small business, is really come.
Joe, can I just want to add, so Minto, we have some representatives from Minto here. I live in the Beechwood community, and the issue of street-oriented retail has been quite controversial for us. And there are some developers whose names won't be mentioned, who are basically thumbing their nose at the rules, saying essentially there's no way we can make street-oriented retail work. I mean, COVID wiped us all out. There's just, on the other hand, the city's saying 15-minute neighborhood, retail really matters. So there's this disconnect between the economic realities and the aspirations that we have. understanding that what we build now is going to last for 30 years and that's going to change. But if you don't put the spaces in now, they're not going to be there. Anyway, along comes a developer called Minto and started discussions with the community very early on about this. And the community was very upset about what Minto had done on their first building on Beechwood, which is exactly that. They custom built the space for a LCBO. And then LCBO changed their business model and that space sat there empty, way too expensive for anyone else to rent. And for their current building, they've taken a very different model. Typically that ground floor commercial space is divided into very thin, long commercial spaces that run all the way through. And Minto basically said, we'll just run that corridor down the first floor as well. What's behind it will be residential and this very shallow stuff facing the street will be commercial. And that those spaces are small enough that they will actually support small businesses. So I've been very impressed with their willingness to talk to the community and kind of work through exactly the kind of issues you're talking about. So I don't know if that, I just wanted to jump in there and say that we are, we're struggling with this on the community level as well. That said, Rodney, the space I love at Zibi next to the plaza there, sometimes it's got stuff in it and sometimes it's sitting there vacant, right? So
it's super tough. Like
it's super tough.
And I just got back earlier this week. I was in Israel and seeing the cities of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and seeing like how crazy vibrant they were just really makes our downtown look so lousy. And this idea about independent shop, like the Rexalls and the banks is, their contributions to vibrancy, urban vibrancy is lousy. But the reality, at Zibi, we have designed for a lot of small scale retail and we just can't find them. We just can't get them. And in part, it's because our retail environment is just dominated by the Costcos and the Canadian Tires and the Loblaws, these massive behemoths that in other places, like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, one Costco is 1,500 small little stores that line the streets in those cities. So what we've tried to do in lieu at Zibi is host as many events and activities, like create these public spaces. So we just had Festibière, which is kind of a French theme, music, beer, food. We've hosted food festivals and eco festivals and indigenous events and little conferences. We've created the spaces for that kind of life. So that's why you're like, sometimes I go there and there's things happening and sometimes there's not. Our preference would have been to have 100 little stores lining those street fronts. But in the meantime, that's how we kind of operate.
I got one observation on Ottawa because I don't come here that often, but I was involved in the new official plan process and I looked at the demographics. Ottawa does not attract immigrants. I mean, it's really extraordinary how few immigrants come to Ottawa compared to other places. Who creates small business? Immigrants. Basically, what the first immigrant business is food. And what's happened in Toronto particularly is the ugliest part of a city, those terrible strip malls in Scarborough, North York, they are now packed full of the best food you can eat anywhere. Because it's this extraordinary offering from around the world. And I think there should be a campaign in Ottawa to really make this an immigrant welcoming, friendly place, because I'm not sure, candidly, right now, you're getting the extraordinary benefit that crash of that tidal wave of immigrants that are going to every other city in the country are getting.
I just want to jump in one because I think there's one important piece. I agree with that. But the question was framed, a little bit about how do we foster cultural sustainability, and the threat being the condo tower that comes in that's got the ground floor Rexall and the bank and taking out the little local shop that I like. I would say that the flip side of that, though, is that we don't have enough density to really support those local shops. And we, we have a big investment in Hull, and I love Hull. And people here, probably don't spend enough time in Hull. I always say it, the best food, the best art, the best music is all in the neighborhood of Hull. And in part because they have that network of cheaper spaces, a real commitment to food, etc. But if you look, like, the best parts of Hull are Rue Eddy, Rue Portage, Rue Laval. And for probably most of the audience, I could be talking about, somewhere in Europe because people don't head over there. But trust me, those are the best little spots, these little streets, little businesses. And we own some properties on those places with really cheap street front places on Eddy, on Laval, where we're renting it out for like $800. Cheap. We can't find local businesses that want to move in them. The number of businesses that are shuttering down, and in part because they sustain themselves on government office buildings. That's what sustained those little streets. The reality is those government workers aren't there at all, or they're there now, starting to be 2 days a week. And it's just not enough that 5 days a week, there's nobody down there. If there was more density, if there was, like, why is places like Tel Aviv so happening and have all this little retail and all this great food and all the shops? Because they also have 60-story towers. And even if they have a Rexall, which they don't, but even if they had a Rexall on the ground floor, all those people help sustain those kinds of businesses. And right now we're struggling a little bit with creating the right clusters of density that could help give our city a little more vibrancy, or a lot more vibrancy.
I have a question, please. Thank you, Carleton School of Architecture, and gentlemen, for your presentations, your time here. In densification, trying to get millennials into their own owned home and build some equity. To densification, co-op housing. How many square feet are you figure a single unit would have for a single person or couple to buy and live in? And what would be the common space that would be associated with that? And how many units would you want to have for that common space? So there's some magic numbers that you're thinking?
Is that a question about co-living, or is that a question about the co-ops in general?
Co-living co-ops. So co-living, as to how it's done, that's kind of the second part, but co-housing where there is some shared space and some personal living space.
Yeah. We're doing our first building now. So in terms of that has a co-living component, in terms of whether we have the magic sauce on that, what we've done again is have a spectrum, not a one size fits all. So you can be renting, effectively a single bedroom, which is like 400 square feet, but then you have a lot of common area. Like you have several thousand square feet of common area on that floor, to, full scale 1,000 square foot units that would be 2-bedroom plus 10 units. And there won't be any common element on that floor, but you can, take the stairs or take the elevator down on that front. So what we've tried to do is create a little bit of a spectrum there.
Sure, thank you. So just to maybe a realignment of expectations on the Millennium crew is, 400 square feet would give you a bedroom for sure, a bathroom. You would have some living space that would be compact, and then you could enjoy the bigger common space for the football games or the get-togethers. Or is that at the entry level? That would be 400 feet would be kind of the number?
Yeah.
Okay. And how many units would you need in a co-op situation to balance off the common space? Kind of 10 co-op units at, let's say, 400 feet, and then how many square feet would be given to the common space? I'm putting you on the spot here, I know.
I don't have the exact square footage up, but yeah, now we're significantly over the minimum requirements in that building, but no, I would say that'd be smaller than typical in Ottawa. Yeah. Yeah, 500 square feet. I mean, we have 500 square foot one beds, but that would be on the, it's still a little bit on the small side, more 550, 575, something like that.
Because I think a lot of the stuff going on in Toronto, 500 square feet for a single bedroom, that's I think where some of those are starting, right? And there's no common space. That's your unit.
Well, for sure, Toronto's always been a little tighter than Ottawa.
One thing that can be explored there too, and I haven't personally gotten to do much of this, but I'm excited about this idea from a design aspect. So let's talk in a few years and let's see if I've gotten to implement it yet. But looking at some of those, flexible spaces within your building so that you've got flexible furniture systems so that your bedroom can actually convert into a living space as well. Like we've done that on like one-off units in some of our buildings, but we haven't done it yet within a building as more of a, just a theme for the whole space. But we're in discussions with a few different providers to see, where that's going to go, and hopefully it'll pan out in the near future.
So at Mindful Habitats, we have worked with some projects like that where we were looking at affordable units, but the zoning bylaws limit that if it's a one bedroom that you're selling it for, it be, say, I think it was 35 square meters that was supposed to be that way. But my question is, then we had another project which we were working with the Chinese, the church here in Ottawa, and they were trying to build near, what was the area? Near the St. Laurent Mall. And what they were trying to do is do a co-housing kind of a situation, but they were trying to bring in older or young seniors and student population together in a building and trying to have rooming houses. But what really limited them from going ahead with that project was the development fee that the city then charged. Is that something that you would like to talk about? Like, because each unit that is added in a co-living space, you have to have a development fee that you have to pay to the city. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Development fees, the number of projects that have been, killed because of development fees is, and the more creative you try and get, the more challenging oftentimes some of those elements become.
Yeah, when Larry Beasley comes and talks to us, he mentions that it's different in different provinces. In Ontario, the bulk of money that's made available for improvements to the public realm come from development charges. And if you stop charging the developments, you get density with no improvement to the public realm, and that's not good. He claims that in Quebec, much of what we pay for out of development charges comes out of tax revenue. But we in Ontario are so resistant to any raise in taxes that it's really the developers we're asking to bear the brunt of those public realm improvements. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place. Joe, you might want to talk about that.
Well, it's an intensely complicated business, but there is no question right now, but that the elaborate system of development charges and the tangle of regulation are conspiring together to essentially choke far too much development. I don't have any sympathy for the Ford government's invasion of the Greenbelt, but I do have sympathy for the motive. Essentially, what he wants to, Ford wants to go around with a great big axe and just chop all the regulation. Well, so do I. Actually, I think we've got to an absurd point in both regulation and in development costing, because essentially the way we work, the political system works, is that homeowners vote for councils, renters don't. And homeowners' interest is in having nothing happen. That and essentially and we've also, I mean, my profession is really, I think, has to take some of the blame. We have knitted regulation. All of a sudden we decided it was a good idea to have a street wall that was the same width as the street, and then we should step back from that on a 45-degree angular plane, and then we should be no higher than 8 stories, because that's what they do in Paris. Well, try and build that building. It's killingly expensive, as you know, and it leaks. Nobody has stopped us planners knitting, and we've just knit way too much. So I'm in Houston right now.
It reminds me of, I mean, you read Peter Hall's book, which is one of recommended to everybody.
Can we put in a plug for Peter Hall?
Yes, let's put in a plug for Peter Hall.
The best writer on cities and planning.
Unbelievable.
Peter Hall, because I actually worked with him a bit.
Yeah.
He did stuff. He wasn't just a writer and an academic.
Yeah.
He was the head of planning for the Greater London Council. He knew stuff. Anyhow.
Wow.
So, carry on.
now I'm forgetting what I wanted to say. What we were just talking about was, now I'm going to embarrass myself. Joe, you were saying development charges. Oh, I was saying, that's right. So he talked about the kind of ebb and flow of planning staffs in city, and said that that as there was a pressure for development, planning staffs got bigger and bigger, and then they hit a moment, I think in the 70s, where nobody was building anything anymore, and cities just sorry, Evan, don't plug your ears, just fired the planning staff, created enterprise zones, where there was no, do what you want. And it was all about kickstarting the whole process from scratch. And Joe, it sounds like you're almost saying we almost need to get to that point where we just sort of throw it all out. And then, sorry, that's.
I had one of the most interesting things that happened, jobs I did, as I was indicating, I did a lot of work in Manchester. And in 1996, there was a huge IRA bomb placed in the center of Manchester, and it went off on a Saturday lunchtime, and it basically blew to pieces the entire city center of Manchester for about a kilometer ring. And luckily it blew up a bunch of really awful 1970s buildings. So suddenly you realized you couldn't mess around. You had to put the city center back together again. So the minister of planning, whoever he was, came down and basically said, I'm going to suspend all regulation. So you can do whatever you like, just do the right thing. And it was the best instruction I've ever gotten in my life on a planning job. So the bomb was right outside Marks and Spencer's, which in the UK is sort of ground zero of the retail center. And we got the Marks and Spencer's open, completely rebuilt, completely in 3 years. And we could, if we had to go through a rezoning and an official plan amendment and a development agreement, could never have happened. And I wish that we had a psychological bomb in our cities. And I think that the housing crisis is it.
Yeah, also in Hall's book, the whole discussion of Canary Wharf, which if those of you know, the whole Docklands was divided between 3 or 4 different boroughs, none of whom could decide what to do with it or agree with each other. And then ultimately, the woman whose name should not be mentioned drew a line around it all and said, okay, I'm extracting this from all of your boroughs. This is a giant enterprise zone. Let's see what the market does. And it produced something extraordinary. So sometimes you do have to do, very, very good things. So I'm speaking because I'm not seeing any hands up, but any other? Oh yes, okay. I'll let you get back to it. And we're going to wrap up.
Hi, I couldn't help but notice you're talking about something that sounds an awful lot like co-housing communities where you mentioned, you know, where you have your corridors close enough to form community like they in Old Manchester. You're talking about a quarter of housing to be rental, and that's really healthy mix with three-quarter market equity homes. This is what co-housing communities do, where people group into a community, they own their own home, and they share space within that space. So similar to what you guys were talking about. They are pretty critical, like how many units you can put together to make it really feel like a community and work like a community. And something that you also brought up, and here's my question, is this idea of how do you, among rentals and tenants, how do you sort of invest in them so that they get a sense of ownership? And I know in some European countries, they have much longer rental tenures, like 5 years. And in that case, the tenant starts to feel that ownership. And that's something, I work for Ottawa Co-housing, that's something we're considering when we develop our co-housing communities. Why not have rentals with these longer leases so that the renters feel more responsibility towards a community and gaining some of the positivity that you guys were talking about. Is there any reason we don't have longer rental tenures? Does anybody know?
Well, first of all, awesome that you're with Ottawa Co-housing. I think that's fantastic. I'd love to see a lot more co-housing in the city. There's been a few stabs at it. I know there, but not a lot of traction to date. So I Godspeed in making those happen. You know, in terms of rental tenancies, effectively, you know, even though people sign a year lease, like effectively I don't like the term landlord because it sounds so antiquated, but as a housing provider, you can't turf somebody out after 1 year anyway, right? The lease automatically renews even if you sign a lease for 1 year. So I'm not sure whether you were, you know, kind of explicitly signing a 5-year lease. I'm not sure how many tenants would sign a 5-year lease, because then if they wanted to get out early, you know, it would be punitive on their end as opposed to on the housing provider end. Whereas if they want to stay as it's set up now, they can stay. But if they want to leave, they can leave. But I do think there are other ways to try and create that kind of sense of ownership into a community, or sense of investment into a community. And that's, you know, that's one of the things we've been really trying to do. So as for instance, the rental building that was completed at ZB on the Gatineau side, you know, you can access the community gardens. You know, I think just even the act of planting a garden, you know, creates a kind of sense of investment. But one of the amenity spaces that we put in there was a full scale kind of commercial kitchen, and the idea and work with one of the existing tenants on kind of a dinner program and such. So, you know, that idea that co-housing does so beautifully, these kind of ideas of shared dinner and getting a chance to know your neighbor and feeling invested in the community through the kind of social networks, I think can be really, really powerful. So, you know, that's one of the way we're trying to get to that same angle. And even before we were working on the ZB project, we went and studied a development called BEDZ, the Beddington Zero Energy Development, which was the kind of prototype for the One Planet Communities program. And it had, you know, a district energy system, which didn't work great, but they had, you know, they had community gardens, they had passive and active solar, these built-in integrated photovoltaics, like they did the whole works from a sustainability, recycled materials. But one of the things I found really compelling as we were doing some surveys there is people just sort of saying, and whether they were renters or owners, people just sort of saying, I can't leave this community because my best friend lives here. I can't leave this community because my babysitter's 2 doors down. I can't leave this community because we do community dinners once every 2 weeks, you know? So trying to create that kind of community that I think can be tenure agnostic.
Yeah, great presentations. Thank you very much. I'd like to suggest that maybe we do have that bomb that you're looking for. You go to a pharmacy, you see a brochure on suicide prevention among seniors. I have friends who have a 12-year-old daughter, and the parents meet once a week. They plan to sit down for an hour to discuss whether or not their daughter's going to commit suicide. She's 12 years old. I think in history, we've never been so connected and isolated at the same time. And I'd like to know if any of you are addressing that in your professions. I mean, you talk about planners. Every house has to face the street. Everyone gets in their vehicle, in their garage. They drive to work, into another garage. They get out of that garage. They get into an elevator. Everything that's being pushed on us is isolationist. How do we turn the tide to prevent that bomb from going off?
Yeah, I think Ottawa is too small, and I think it needs to add 1 million population, because I think you're not, as a city, quite at the critical time, population density, and if I understand the question right, that allows you to find alternatives to the car that are mass workable. You've got to get over a certain level, which I think would also be a good thing, frankly, for the city to do anyhow, because the kinds of lack of business energy at the local level is caused largely by the fact that you have a slightly older population than most Canadian cities do. And you have, to a very significant extent, you're a mono industry town. And that's not creating the alternative lifestyle, the alternative way of living in a city that the immigrant populations have brought to the other Canadian cities. So, and with that, if you can basically hold the size of the city tight, add 1 million people, because there's lots and lots of room, get up to close to 2 million. And then I think a change of state happens in a city at that point. It becomes a slightly different, denser, much more urban place. And all the kind of cooking of those molecules creates a more fascinating place. The kind of thing that you were talking about before. And there's no question when you look at the numbers that Ottawa is essentially flat. And it's a curiosity because it could be so much more.
I'll just jump in for 1 second because I really appreciate the question. I do think there is a crisis of social isolation, a lack of connection to neighbors. Where it's interesting because we're in a church, and I was having a conversation with somebody today over lunch, another developer, and we've done a couple of church redevelopment projects. And regardless of what anyone's spiritual leanings might be, this was one of the institutions where people would create social connections that people just don't go anymore, and would create social connections at different economic levels and be forced out of their houses and meet neighbors face to face and do dinners together, etc. These institutions are vanishing, and we gave a lot of thought when we were creating the master plan to how do you look at the built environment in a way that enables social connection. There's an amazing book called Happy City, and maybe you've read it already because it sounds like you're plugged in. Charles Alexander, I think, is the name of the author, and he's actually done this study about like if you put the house too close to the street, nobody wants to hang out on the front stoop or the porch because they don't feel like they have the degree of privacy. But if you put it too far back, they won't engage with their neighbors. It's too isolating, right? You know, how do you get people out of the car? You were referencing Jane Jacobs, right? And Jane Jacobs had this phrase that we talked about all the time, the serendipity of the sidewalk encounter, right? Like how are friendships born in the built environment? And you know, the best kind of neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs would talk about in Toronto, you would bumble into somebody at the little corner grocery store, and then you would see them maybe out walking their dog, and then maybe you'd see them, you know, hanging out down at the river or whatever it would be. But, you know, after you've seen them a few times, maybe once you might not, and then, you know, maybe you're both working in the community garden and you might strike up a bit of a conversation, and then, you know, that's how friendships are born. And so we really thought a lot about, you can't force friendships. You can't force people to know their neighbors, but getting people out of the car as a starting point, because that's isolating, and creating this network of spaces where people would have these gentle social collisions, parks, plazas, events happening, small scale retail. You know, I think that's part of the answer. So certainly a large part of our thinking.
I mean, you're talking at an urban scale. It can be something as simple as, why is there not a niche across from the elevators with an outside window with a couple of chairs, maybe a few plants, that two people in a corridor in an apartment building can actually get to know each other? I mean, how many people know at least two people in the corridor in their apartment building? Probably not very many. We need to build social spaces within the buildings as well as within the community.
Definitely.
One of the interesting things I've noticed that seem to be working fantastically well for social interaction are dog parks. Everybody seems to have gotten a dog during COVID. And it's quite extraordinary now. I don't know, I'm seeing my daughter. It's like, I've met so many people. I never knew any of my neighbors, but there they all were in the dog park. So a minor thing, but one benefit of COVID.
Thank you. I think we'll wrap up on that note. It's more than 8 p.m., but I just want to thank all of you and our past panelists, but also the audience. You've been you've been great, phenomenal, because the questions that we got from you were great. The conversations do end today. This is our fourth, but we would want to continue the conversations into other forms, like, you know, you can give us ideas, we can collaborate and work together, but we are looking to continue these in some form or the other going forth. All the recordings of the past sessions are there on mindfulhabitats.ca. You can access them, and we are also planning to have transcripts of all the conversations that we've had. It'll take some time, but we hope to get there. So thank you again for being here and for the amazing thoughts and conversations.
Well, pleasure presenting.
Yeah, likewise.
Sure, pass will cross.